Hello and welcome. I'm Miguel Padró with the Aspen Institute's Business and Society program. I'm going to be your host today for a conversation on worker voice in the new economy. We have four exceptional panelists for our conversation today, and I will introduce them in just a minute. First, I will just take a minute to set the stage for our conversation. And I guess the stage begins with about a year ago, Aspen BSP launched a new project that we call our Idea Lab on worker voice in corporate governance. We convened an unusual mix of experts in that work, and it included highly respected corporate governance experts and worker organizers and worker advocates, as well as scholars. Over the course of numerous sessions, we had a bunch of remarkable conversations, really challenging conversations about what role workers should have in American corporate governance specifically. Our original plan with the lab was to produce a report of sorts based on those conversations. But the old pearl that announcing your intentions is a good way to hear God laugh proved true in this case. The lab ended up producing three major outputs: public policy foundation that would support worker voice in the economy, a new concept idea to help close the voice gap between the front line of business and the C-suite, and then our most recent output focused on ideas to bring worker voice into the corporate boardroom. So our conversation today is in some ways a culmination of the work we've done over the last year, and two of our panelists were very active participants in that work. But really, I think the better way to think of this conversation is that it's another stepping stone in an ongoing journey to improve capitalism, improve both decision-making and accountability inside companies, and to make work life better and more consistent with our democratic values in our country. So let me welcome our panelists on screen so we can start to hear from them. Hello, guys. Great to see you. Thrilled to have you with us. So joining us today, we have Lisa Skeet Tatum, who's founder and CEO of the company Landit, which is a career pathing platform that increases the success of women and diverse groups in the workplace and enables companies to attract, develop, and retain high potential diverse talent. Doug Shaw, who's a fellow at the Corporate Law and Governance Center at Rutgers University. Doug's also an Aspen BSP fellow, whom I personally lean on way too often for expertise and thought partnership on all kinds of things corporate governance. Michelle Green is President Emeritus of the Long-Term Stock Exchange, which is a US-based stock exchange for long-term focused companies and like-minded investors. And Bianca Agustin, who is Corporate Accountability Director for United for Respect, which is a multiracial nonprofit organization fighting to improve the lives of people who specifically work in retail. Welcome, all four of you. I'm so happy to have you for this conversation, and I can't wait to just pick your brains a little bit on what I've come to learn over the last year is a very fascinating but also really complex topic around not only worker voice, but worker voice in our power structures in our firms, and how to translate worker voice into real better decisions and real action inside firms. So I want to start talking about something that a lot of people respond to the topic of worker voice with an eye roll, and they say, haven't we done this before? Isn't this just about unions? Isn't this just about labor unions? Isn't that a 20th century conversation? So I'd like to talk about the current context and why it seems like worker voice is having this moment in headlines and even in one-on-one conversations we have with firms. So I guess I'd love to, Lisa, I'm going to start with you on this, but correct me if I'm wrong. We're not just rehashing a 20th century conversation about unions and companies. There's something else here. Maybe there's a lot more to this now. But what is it? What do you see from where you're sitting as a CEO? And I should say your firm serves the employee population as well. So you see these issues from so many different angles. What is it about the context that's causing worker voice to have this moment?
Well, thank you. And it's amazing to be here with all of you and the amazing panelists. And I would say there's really two things going on from my perspective. So first is expectation. So we know that organizations can no longer sit on the sidelines, no longer be obvious with their commitments and where they are. And that also applies to their workforce. And we know that we're really living in uncharted territory and waters, and there are countless examples of companies that put out the wrong statement or the wrong product that appears tone deaf because they don't have the diversity of voices around the table who are proximate to the people that they're serving. And so this notion of it having a moment, I actually think it's been there all along. It's just that it's magnified because the stakes are high. Because whether it's the structure of the workforce, whether it is stakeholder capitalism, all of those items require more expertise, more domain experience, and more voices to be around the table. Not to mention, we have a war on talent going on. You're only going to win that war on talent when the people in your organization feel a sense of belonging and as if they have a voice. So it's no longer the right thing to do. It's an economic and competitive imperative to doing so.
Thanks, Lisa. Bianca, I want to go to you. Lisa's a CEO, and you're an organizer of workers. Traditionally, we would think of your two perspectives as kind of in conflict. But can I just have you kind of answer the similar question to from where you sit? What is it in this moment? Oh, you're on mute.
We did all. No, I agree with what Lisa said. I actually think our positions are not that different. Probably for all of the reasons Lisa just laid out, we are in a very unique moment in history, and I think what has happened, not just with the pandemic that is arguably not over, and with the racial justice reckoning that has been happening in this country for the last, you could argue, our lifetimes, that's really in stark relief in the last few years. Workers have been at the center of those movements, both, whether organized or unorganized. And I think we are starting to see lots of creative formations around the country that in my mind capture what is this gap between boards of directors, CEOs, and frontline workers. And I think everything that's happening in LA County with the public health councils to some of the proposals my organization has put forward at some large retailers like the Pandemic Advisory Council, these are creative solutions to the same issue. I don't think this is a cookie cutter solution. I think what we're trying to figure out is how do we insert that perspective, the frontline worker perspective, into corporate decision making? And I think there are many ways to do it.
Michelle, you're seeing this from a totally different perspective at the Long-Term Stock Exchange. I mean, you're supposed to be a home for these like rising IPOs and the companies that are going to be our future household names. Do you see this like in an IPO process? Like with emerging companies that are, is this making its way into those conversations?
Yeah, it absolutely is. And one of the things that we did at the Long-Term Stock Exchange, and one of the reasons that we actually created a new exchange is because you create new rules. And part of our rules involve companies really recognizing the contributions that employees make and systematically rewarding those contributions and engaging with their employees. So, we obviously have a self-selected group of companies who are choosing to follow those standards, but we're really hearing a lot from companies, how do we do this better? Here's some creative ideas we're approaching this with, what are you hearing from other companies? And I think part of it, I agree with everything that both Lisa and Bianca said, but I think in addition, it's not optional anymore. Employees are using their voice in whatever ways they can, right? So we've seen that at Google or Amazon. And so this is not something that companies can choose to do. Those days are past. And that's why I think it's a very different conversation. And so the companies that we're engaging with are not asking if, they're asking how.
Doug, our board's ready for this. You're like my resident cynic whenever I'm feeling like really progressive and optimistic about change. Our board's ready for this?
I'd say by and large, no, just because, in the past, worker voice has not really been part of the job description in terms of what the board is overseeing, at least it should be implicit. But I think, if you look at the board and how it's set up, really they're there to oversee, the top 5 or 10 employees. I mean, that's really who they pay attention to the most. And they look at, kind of like comp and benefits, the larger plans. But even that, they're looking at it not from a worker satisfaction level. They're looking at it from more of a financial and performance oriented perspective. And so I don't think, and boards are very kind of slow to change and resistant to change, and they are able to do that for a variety of reasons. And so, I think it's one of those things where there probably has to be some generational turnover and some turnover that's really diversity driven for the boards to really start to get it. But I think that, like everything, the pandemic forced people to think about a lot of things, and worker voice was one of them because of, obviously something affecting the entire workforce of whatever company you're at. So I think it's moving in the right direction.
So when we're looking at, Lisa, you mentioned the kind of complexity that is now so obvious. And this was true before the pandemic and before the kind of top line headline grabbing social justice protests and everything else. The complexity was ramping up for companies, maybe in part to globalization, technology, any number of things. And you mentioned expectations. How do you do that? Like, how, as a leader of an organization, it's one thing to kind of recognize that there's a lot of complexity. How do you set that up? How do you equip your organization to kind of receive these signals, if you will, from a vast universe that is now, I guess we're calling it a stakeholder universe now, but can you just talk a little bit about that from a leader's perspective? How do you make sure that voices get to you?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting, and Doug mentioned kind of the board, and I think of board evolution. I've had the privilege of being very early, where if you're at a startup, you have a lot more exposure to different workers. You see a lot more people, a lot of more voices raised to the top. As you go on to bigger and more public companies, well, then, as Doug said, it's much more filtered. And so one of the things that I say I do and other CEOs is you ask yourself, if you're solving for something, do you have the right people around the table? Do you have people that have the expertise and the perspective? Are you seeing and being filtered by the same 2, 3, 4, or 5 people, or is it more broad? And so someone said to me, well, it's hard to do that when you have a larger company, but I had the pleasure of being with someone who runs a very large pharmaceutical company, and by choice and by alignment with values, he said, you know what, we're going to make sure that different voices have exposure to the executive committee. So they're not going to allow the message to be watered down, but I would say start local. Look at what's happening in the meeting. Look at the culture. Are people being shut down, or do they feel as if they can step into it? About 2 years ago, I heard the story of the very unfortunate tragedy around the explosion of the space shuttle many moons ago. And it's well known that the people who were further down in the organization knew there was a problem, but it never raised to the top. And so you think about all of the different ways in which it can benefit. You have to create the culture for people to have the safety to speak up and to be validated.
So this notion of kind of the filter, Doug, you introduced this actually. You introduced that concept in our last output from the Worker Voice Lab, where you said, well, boards hear worker voice, but I think you used the term a thick filter. It comes through in a thick filter. Can you just elaborate on that?
Yeah. So if you see, boards get their information from management. The information they get starts kind of at a low level, and it's always a slide deck for some reason. And so it starts with the deck at a low level, and then there's so many different levels of human touch point where someone has kind of the discretion to say, I'm not sure the board really needs to hear that or cares about that, or let's massage the language, let's tighten it up, all these kind of stock phrases. And then it gets to the general counsel, it gets to this, and then by the time it gets to the CEO, and after the CEO's through with it, this is like the most polished rock, you're going to find that goes to the board. And so, they're not getting the authentic voice. And it's been filtered by people who have an interest in making it very smooth. We also, in my article, we talked about, do boards get kind of, one-on or in-person exposure to workers. And, the thing is, it's announced. Everybody knows the board is coming to the factory. The senior management there has an interest in making sure everything looks nice. It's kind of like the Beijing Olympics. They shut down the factories for a couple of weeks so all the smog goes away. And then after the Olympics over, let's start it up again. So, they're not getting a realistic picture. They're getting kind of the official tour of North Korea. It's, I think it's difficult. I think board members have to be proactive if they really want to figure this out.
I think that's the key. Board members cannot be passive. They have to ask the tough questions. They have to, hold people accountable, and then also have the very real conversation with the leader, the manager, right? If you're not getting the exposure, how can you as a fiduciary be fluent in the business if you have that, what is quote a wall, which is more like a platinum or a plutonium wall, blocking you from getting the information, not so that you can be, run the business, so that you can be nose and fingers out to be more effective.
So Bianca, your work is in some ways trying to overcome these filters, it seems like, and get more kind of direct.
Well, everything Doug said resonated with me. I mean, I speak to Walmart and Amazon associates every week. And, during the height of the pandemic, this was just so crystal clear to me that even after both of those companies came out with very detailed COVID safety guidelines and policies, Walmart even put into place a COVID emergency leave policy. And so the PR was there. I think the intention of the directors was good, but they have a vast fleet of facilities and stores in the country. There's no way that they could guarantee even an implementation of those policies, and they were not. Workers in those facilities were able to talk to you about what was actually happening on the ground. And I think that, to me, became the valuable source of information that was just missing. We're talking about tweaks. How do you make this better? How do you actually make sure your store managers, your facility managers are properly implementing policies? I think this was the fine point was made in the brief that you put out, Aspen put out earlier this month. But I think, to remember that, workers by and large want their employers to succeed, and they want to be able to be safe at work. And there is an overlapping interest there that I think we lose when you don't have that direct communication. Walmart, for example, has tons of policies in place where they, sort of tout them as their way to get worker input. These are surveys, these are focus groups, usually chosen by mid-level management. So the filter is there, the filter is thick, it is real in workplaces across the country. The other point I wanted to make, this is something that Lisa was saying, is, in companies like Walmart, the role of the independent director is just so crucial. And I think when you're looking for directors who will start asking tough questions, who will be willing to sort of do something a little against the grain, we're really looking at those independent directors at some very large, tightly held public companies like Walmart.
Yeah, I'll jump in there to add, I think it's interesting. One of the projects that I undertook as part of the Aspen work was interviewing a number of directors. And these were all directors who sat on both US boards and on European boards where there was direct worker representation. So they were able to kind of contrast those things. And one of the interesting takeaways, kind of the other side of the coin, Bianca, was workers saying, there was a problem. One director was saying there was a problem with the way that our CEO was treating women executives, and we, the board, did not know. And every worker we talked to after the fact knew. We didn't cue in on it till the last female executive left. And if we had, and it was such a well-known issue at the company, if we had engaged directly with workers, anyone could have told us this. So that was one example, but more broadly, what these directors were all saying was, and COVID was a really strong example they used, was during COVID, for example, the board members who were also workers in their European boards were able to give them kind of that firsthand perspective and help them to craft policies that were more realistic in some cases in terms of how they would be implemented. Whereas they felt on their US boards, though, as you said, Bianca, the desire was there, it was often hard to really connect with an ongoing, authentic worker voice in the same way that they could in some of their European boards. So I think there is, among many directors, a desire to get that authentic perspective, if only because they realize it helps to mitigate risk and to create opportunity for them. So I think that desire at least seems to be growing.
It requires them, I agree with you 100%, to ask the right questions. I was on the board the other day and we were looking at KPIs and we were looking at diversity, and it was just writ large people of color. And I'm like, that's too nebulous. You have to actually get granular so that you can see the nuance, because that's where the story is. And so that requires directors to be activated, as you said, Bianca, to have an outside perspective, but be willing to ask the right questions and measure the right things. Otherwise, the story and what's really going on gets obscured by not having the right kind of dashboard or accountability, quite frankly.
Yeah, and in terms of mentioning metrics and dashboards, someone I know asked the question about, what about surveys and stuff like that? I think the companies that do engagement surveys and employee sentiment surveys, the intention is good. The problem is, like all surveys, these are aggregated statistics across, broad populations. And so you can see some, it's very hard to get the real picture from an aggregated employee sentiment survey and to know, well, what do we do with this now? The directors are going to see it at the highest level. They're not going to get kind of the granular breakdown of, per region, per unit, all that stuff. And because you have to keep anonymity, it's even hard to provide some of that. So, I think the employee surveys play a certain kind of role in terms of directionally where things are headed. But yeah, it takes more digging, and the directors have to do that digging, but at the same time not be disruptive and not be kind of like a rogue director, calling people up randomly and, kind of freaking everybody out. So it's a tough one. I think it's going to take some figuring out on the part of the board and others who advise the board on what's the most effective way to do this.
Well, and I think
are we going to
not institutional.
Go ahead.
We don't have those mechanisms, and if we start to create some institutional mechanisms to enable it, and I agree with Bianca, it's not one size fits all at all. And I love the creative solutions that she's working on. But we can't just say, oh, independent directors, you personally need to just ask smart questions. Like, that's not going to get us where we need to go. It's not enough.
Yeah, and this is on my mind now as I've heard this last exchange. Is I can imagine people who are listening in today, at least some, might be kind of squeamish about just relying on like very enlightened directors, like and leaving it all on them. And Michelle, you kind of touched on about institutionalizing things, or how do we build structures, or frankly, where would the pressure even come from? Where would the pressure come from to flip the enlightenment switch that we need for directors to ask those questions? Bianca, I'm teeing this up for you because this is
I actually think Michelle answered this question in her intro. We're seeing this from many places. I mean, we have legislation that has been proposed by multiple senators where worker voice Representation in the corporate boardroom is part of the package. Last shareholder season, there were over a dozen proposals filed on co-determination or worker voice, at companies. I just think, and, those proposals did remarkably well. My organization filed a co-determination proposal 2 years ago. Last year, the pandemic advisory proposal that we filed got double the amount of votes. I mean, we were just seeing an uptick in support for this concept. And I do think it's telling from my perspective that our, really sort of direct line into representation on the corporate board didn't do as well. It also wasn't in the middle of a pandemic. You really saw both individual shareholders, but also ISS, the proxy advisor, recommend a vote yes. And when we read their reasons for that recommendation, it was so clear that they saw that there was this gap between the board and frontline workers when it came to health and safety in the workplace. And so I think we need to keep pointing to examples where this gap has a real impact, not just on workers, but on the company. And I just feel like that's going to be an uptick. I think the pressure is coming from all sides. And I think there's just growing support in the public, wanting to figure this out, whether you're a worker or not. I just, my conversations, it's been over the last 2 years, it's just, I've personally seen a softening among the Walmart investor and shareholder stakeholders for this, really wanting to engage with frontline workers. And for me, I think that's where I would start. I saw a question in there, like sort of in what realm, from where. I actually think this can come from many places, and it's really about companies sort of seeing that. And I think they are filling it. I mean, I think Michelle and Lisa were right when they opened. That's really not a question of should we, it's a question of how.
There was a point, Bianca, you raised earlier that I wanted to come back to. And this notion that workers want their employers to succeed. And Edelman recently did some really interesting survey research on worker voice, which is telling in and of itself that this global corporate communications firm is actually interrogating these issues. It felt, one of the things that came out of that research was that employees trust their employers more than they trust any other institution in society. And it was something like 78%. Like, it was a huge gap, like between, they'll trust their employers a lot. But there was a flip side to the research too, which was that, and Lisa, you mentioned this earlier, about expectations rising. And the expectations of employees are also rising while they're investing this trust in their employers, which made me think of boy, that could be a risky position for a company to be in if you don't kind of meet those expectations. So you start to generate kind of festering resentment and that kind of stuff that can eventually kind of rebound. So I want to talk a little bit about this risk. It used to be that I think investors and probably the average executive would have thought, if I give my workers more voice, that's risky. That's inviting a risk on the company that our fiduciary responsibility is to curb those risks. Is that changing? And is the risk profile now, do you think it's going to shift to, like, if we don't address these issues, that's the greater risk than actually the disruption of actually giving workers voice? I probably haven't articulated that well at all, but Lisa, I'm going to trust that you're smart enough to make it work.
What's with this constant cold calling? I would say it's interesting because in what I do, sometimes I'll run across an organization, they'll say, well, Lisa, if we invest in the development of our people, they're going to leave, which is one of the most asinine thing I've ever heard. It's like, well, what happens if you don't invest in them? Same thing when it comes to giving people a voice. The biggest risk, one of the biggest risks to any organization is a disengaged employee. And so I saw something recently where it said, when you let people know that they fall short of your expectations, it's not being critical, it's an investment in the relationship. And so those employees or colleagues, whatever, that speak up, I agree with Bianca, it's because they want to see change. And often they want to be a part of the change. That's why with the workplace social injustice, so many people of color are burdened, because it's like, oh, you want change, here you go do it yourself, right? So it's not about risk, it's about what mechanism and support you put in place to actually affect the change. Those that ignore it or don't give voice, not only are going to see flight of talent, the organization is not going to thrive. So I would actually say they have to shift the paradigm and not come from a place of fear, but more from a place of, what are we going to do differently so that we can be engaged and compete?
Doug, do you think boards are going to what's it going to take for a board to shift that paradigm, or does it take a courageous director to stand up in the boardroom? Or that probably doesn't really happen as much, that's so structured, but like, how does this unfold?
I think it's really the CEO. There's only so much a board member can do. They don't show up, they don't show up that often. They're not employees, they never have been. The CEO sets the tone for the board and for the employees. And so it's really, I guess holding the CEO accountable and really pressure testing whether they're sincere about this. And, the board has the power to hire and fire, and this should be part of that, part of that equation. And the board should be able to do certain things to kind of test how genuine the CEO is about caring about kind of worker sentiment. But yeah, it is strange that, when you talk about worker voice, people are like, oh, what that could just lead to trouble. And it's like, no, they trust and they want the company to succeed. Otherwise, they wouldn't be there. Now, of course, some people don't have the choice to just get up and walk and find a new job, but everybody understands that it's in their best interest for the employer to succeed, and that they want to be part of that, and it's up to the CEO also. Yeah, I think, Michelle, your point about expectations is a good one. You got to set the CEO can set the right expectations. Don't go out there and say our employees are most valuable assets, if you can't really show that. And in fact, don't even say that, because frankly, I think for most companies, it's just not true. It's just a line. Or they definitely don't back it up. They definitely don't behave that way. So I think that, if CEOs can be out there and kind of make people understand that here's the deal, we're trying to do the best for the employees, but the employees have to understand this is a business. And I think most employees get it in terms of, look, they can ask for things and we can just be reasonable. They can, if they're not going to just ask for completely unreasonable things and then create a fight. It's like people understand that the company has to do certain things to preserve its profitability, and that is in everybody's best interest.
Well, things
We have an
get
interesting
heated.
question. Oh, go ahead, Lisa.
No, I was going to say, and to Doug's point, things get heated or people get nervous when either people have been ignored or not seen or not supported. And so, or when it gets to the point where it's been pushed down, all of a sudden there's this this point where things start to explode. And so to me, it really comes back to not only CEO, but also culture, right? And so when you enroll and there's trust there, right? You can't have trust if you don't listen. You can't have trust if you don't validate. You can't have trust if you don't allow people to have some outlet and some acknowledgement of their expertise or perspective. And then when in absence of that, that's when you see this them versus they kind of thing that leads to a more destructive dynamic, as opposed to you can't get everything you want, but at least you can be respected and heard and maybe have a seat at the table or sponsorship that allow you to be a conduit to have the voice. Not everyone can sit at a table, especially when you have a large organization, but you can have a voice, you can have an advocate, you can have a surrogate, if you will, that represents those point of views.
I think there's some interesting analogies here to kind of corporate approaches to ESG. You know, for a long time, it's like, we don't want to do those reports because then we're creating liability for ourselves and we don't want to look at that stuff. And there's kind of this growing recognition that like, actually you need to do those things and you're creating liability for yourself if you're not thinking about them. So I think worker voice, particularly worker voice on the board, I think is the same sort of analysis. Those, you know, those companies that put their heads in the sand and say it could create problems, we're not going to change anything, are missing not just an opportunity to reduce risk, because you can potentially hear about risks before they become larger risks, but they're also missing opportunities, because often great ideas will come from the people who know the company best, which are the workers. So I do think that paradigm shift, again, being forced by all of the forces we talked about in the beginning, is really changing that analysis where is the risk? Is it in not doing something? I think it is.
So there are a few interesting audience questions coming in, and these are kind of meaty, so I'd like to get to some of them. And one, Bianca, this one seems right up your alley. Would employee representation on the board mitigate or change the rise of employee-led shareholder activism? Would that really undercut the strategies you've been taking at United for Respect with some of the shareholder activisms?
I don't think so. I mean, I would be interested to hear what others on the panel think, but I actually can envision a scenario in which those are very reinforcing. You know, because you at most would have a few employee representatives on a board or a committee of the board. And depending on the subject matter of the shareholder resolution filed by another employee who also was a shareholder, you could really have an informed conversation and discussion on that issue, you know, where you're having frontline representation on both ends of that conversation. I actually think that would be a scenario in which you could see more employees, you know, with the limiting factor being stockholder, you know, the ability to actually buy stock in their companies. But, you know, I think in that scenario, our members who are stockholders of Walmart, for instance, I think would welcome a conversation with a committee of the board that includes other frontline employees.
Doug, part of what you had recommended in the piece we just published was potentially creating a different board committee, a new board committee to address kind of human capital concerns. Do you envision like if a committee like that was created, is that an alternative to having direct worker representation on boards in your view, or is it a mechanism that is just kind of part of a toolkit?
I mean, I think it's a start in terms of changing just the mindset of how boards look at their jobs. I mean, I think, you know, in my piece, I talk about how right now, you know, the board required committees are audit, executive compensation, and nominating. And all of those are really shareholder oriented committees. You know, if you're talking about stakeholders, what committees cover the other stakeholders? You would think compensation would, but compensation, like I said, is focused so much on CEO comp. You're seeing boards now broaden the scope of the comp committee to become more of an HR human resource oversight committee. You know, I think that really has to take hold more. I think there are a lot of ways you can do this. You could have workers on the board, on those committees. You could have advisory boards. You know, you could have things that are not official board committees, but have, you know, it's a multi-stakeholder group. there are a lot of things to figure out in terms of how you put that together and how you make it work. But it requires some people, chairs of the boards, thinking outside the box, being willing to take some risk here and there. I don't think it's really that difficult to do. It's just that boards have a tendency to think about, okay, what are our peers doing on this? We don't want to get in front of, it's that mentality of, we don't want to do what the other people aren't doing because we don't want to be an outlier. We don't want to be kind of the nail that sticks out, blah, blah, blah. So, it goes back to, a lot of mentality. The CEO can really drive this. If the CEO wanted this, it would happen.
So Michelle and Lisa, there's an audience question here. I'll let whoever jumps in first grab this one. It basically, the framing around boards being hesitant on these things. The question says it ignores that there's a very strong correlation between inclusion and belonging and profit and performance. Like there's data that supports these things, right? That those things work together. Is that data just not being shared in boardrooms, or is it not being believed in boardrooms?
I don't
Well,
know.
Michelle, I'll jump in first. And I think it goes back to what I said before, which is it's amazing sometimes when I get, quote, a deck with the information, the things that really tell the story, they're buried, as opposed to similar to what you would do with just a business performance or organization performance. It's only one or two things that really matter, maybe three max when it comes to KPI. So I think it is the data that's being shown. I think you have to take something that's very nebulous and make it very concrete. And of course, I believe, as most enlightened companies, organizations believe, that the two are not mutually exclusive. Then the question is, well, how do you go about the accountability and the reinforcement of actions or behaviors that have to take place? I'd say I have some boards that we're on one spectrum where it is you're really pushing a rock up a hill, and others that get it and they're looking for the how and the why and what do I do and best practices. So I think you have the whole range going there, but whether they like it or not, people are going to have to get with it because that is what's expected. That's the way the world is moving, and that's what you need in order to compete in the global world in which we live.
Yeah, I think that the boards, it is again this kind of kind of still this kind of 20 years ago type mindset. They do see the data, but there's also competing data. And people can point to that saying, well, this study shows that diversity and women, more women on companies, it really doesn't make much of a difference. But I think you can tell by just looking at board composition and the movement of, the percentage of women board members and the percentage of ethnic minorities, et cetera, on boards. It's moved very slowly, even with a lot of pressure. Last year, there was a big uptick, and it kind of showed that, all right, if people really, really pressure and kind of on a societal level, this becomes a much more important thing. You can do it, it's actually not that hard. But companies generally in the United States, for these types of things, they don't do it unless they're required to do it. Now you have states saying, well, you got to do it. And now people are complaining. We're saying we don't really need this, it's so, I think that alone shows you that there's still a lot of skepticism in terms of does diversity really enhance performance? And you're seeing the same thing with ESG. People are still very skeptical that ESG enhances performance. They say it might actually decrease performance. But the investors, the largest investors have something to say about this, and they're finally saying something, and with real blunt instruments like voting against directors and saying we voted against you because ... So it is moving in the right direction. I think it is speeding up, which is a good sign.
The one thing I would add to that, the only skepticism I tend to hear is that correlation or causation? Is it just that they're better managed companies, so they're looking at the data and doing the right thing, or is it actually because they're doing these things? That said, I think one of the points that Doug made earlier about, oh, everyone just wants to do what everybody else is doing on the board level, that's where I feel kind of hopeful. And again, I work with obviously a self-selected group of companies who are signing on to these higher standards, but we're seeing some really creative approaches coming. And I do feel like there's a tipping point where you get a block of companies that are doing some interesting things that really bring worker voice into the boardroom in a meaningful way, that really, embrace diversity in meaningful ways throughout the company. And I think as you see more and more of that, the pressure on others to do it just increases. So I'm excited about some of the creative approaches coming down the pike.
Very interesting. Thanks, Michelle. A really interesting question here from the audience. It says, in an era where misinformation is rampant, what do you recommend managers do if employees' voice is misinformed, even if they're well-intentioned? I'm sensing a political undertone to this, but maybe that's just me. But I think it's real. It's very interesting. It's a really interesting question about how how do we ensure that all of these voices are actually producing a collective wisdom instead of perhaps a mania?
Yeah, I mean, obviously this is a communication issue. And it shows that, the company has to be constantly engaging with not only its employees, but all of its stakeholders and building trust in that way. If they only come out with statements when there's some controversy and those statements are over lawyered, yeah, everyone's going to be skeptical and be like, oh, give me a break. That's such a canned answer. Or the lawyers wrote that, and I was involved in those statements once upon a time. So, obviously misinformation should be combated with actual factual information, but it's going to depend on the credibility of where it's coming from. And that's where kind of engagement creates trust and relationships and trusted relationships. And you do that before the crisis happens, and generally you'll be able to get through it. You wait until the crisis to start being authentic, and you're not authentic. Everyone can see through it.
So
I think is that cynical enough for you, Miguel?
No. I think it's a really important point, because I think it underscores a theme that I've kind of heard here about the importance of kind of engaging with your workers and other stakeholders. I think it applies as well, but especially with your workers, and making it habitual and making it constant, as opposed to just kind of episodic when a problem comes up, and it's part of almost like the maintenance schedule or maintenance routine for an organization. That is, it's just good maintenance. It's like going out for a walk every day for your body and eating right. And it's an interesting perspective, Doug, I think, about the need for that kind of constant practice. And maybe that's where you see that it's most authentic, if it is constant and reinforced and recurring, as opposed to just episodic and crisis, and kind of crisis management. There's a question here, Michelle. It looks like coming straight at you, and it's from our friend Larry Bieferman, who is also part of the Worker Voice Lab. Hey, Larry. He wants to know, in what specific ways I don't know if you can talk about these yet, because if they're not actually public, but do the companies that might be represented on the long-term stock exchange, what kinds of things are they doing differently around worker voice that like a large company like a Walmart or an Amazon may not have available to them at this stage?
Yeah, so I will talk a little cryptically just for privacy reasons, but there's a company that is thinking of going public soon, for example, fairly large company. And they are looking at making every employee a shareholder, that part of going public is giving shares, not requiring, workers to buy the shares, but giving shares to every worker, and creating some sort of a mechanism where workers can opt into indicating that they plan to stay at the company for a long time, and that gives them even more governance power, more say. And then at the same time, this company is talking about making a certain percentage of the board representatives of the employee shareholders specifically, so that there would be, board representatives of the specific employee shareholders, and in particular, those who have indicated they plan to stay with the company longer. So that's one of the interesting approaches that we're seeing that I think is pretty exciting. But there's some real, I think the use of how do we make more employee shareholders is something that we're seeing a lot of. And the idea that how do we recognize this idea that we've all been talking about today, that employees want the company to succeed, and they want the company to succeed over the long term because they are in many ways more vested than anybody, right? This is their livelihood. And so how do we turn that into not just, shareholding and direct financial ownership, but how do we also turn that into more of a say in governance? So we're seeing some interesting approaches by companies to trying to do that as well.
That's interesting, Michelle. Thanks for that. What strikes me is that to that example, that it's a layered example. It's not just a single mechanism, and it sounds more kind of systematic. And that's really interesting, because I think, at least when I think of worker voice in corporate governance, I'm thinking of it almost, I contrast it with a shareholder-centric, a financial investor-centric form of corporate governance. And of course, the financial investor form of corporate governance is very layered. And for so long, we've thought of kind of the worker response as like a one-note horn of like a union, or there's something to that effect, as opposed to multiple layers and multiple tools kind of stacked on top of each other to drive a better outcome. That's really fascinating. So we have one more. I think we have time for maybe one more audience question, and I'll leave this to any of you. There is a lot of interest, it seems, in the audience questions around kind of co-determination, direct worker representation on boards, and I will emphasize that is just one mechanism. And this came out in our worker voice lab as well, that is possibly one viable mechanism for worker voice, but it's by no means the only one, and that there's lots of room for creativity, as Michelle just outlined, for other mechanisms, and Doug outlined earlier. But this question is very focused on co-determination. Do you see any future with co-determination or dual boards in the U.S. realistically? And I'll add a time frame on this. I'm sure, like, if we stretched out 50 years, maybe we'd see some. But let's say in the next 5 to 10 years, is anyone picking up anything that would suggest that is coming? Bianca, it looks like you have a reaction. You're muted.
No, I was actually curious to see what Doug and Lisa were going to say. The time frame is an interesting one. I think maybe closer to the 10-year, you could see some momentum building where we really see a dual structure. I think more, in my mind, more realistic are sort of the committees and alternatives that Doug and Michelle outlined.
I find it hard to imagine, simply because the investors are going to be very hesitant when there's, you're kind of messing with the governance structure and there's multiple layers. I mean, right now you have all this, debate over multi-class stock. The investors are very concerned about their ownership and their rights. And so I'm not exactly sure how it works in other countries. But, Yeah, there are a number of things that would have to happen, including at the SEC and the stock exchange level. Um, that I just think it's probably too much of a structural change, and possible legal and regulatory ramifications. And I don't think investors would really, push for that right now. I don't think they have much of an interest in doing that.
I agree. Not only do I have a hard time envisioning it, I'm not sure it solves the issue because it's what worker, what group, what's the mechanism for it. And so I actually think it's broad. I mean, boards are notoriously flawed. They're beautiful, but they're flawed. And so I'm not sure that's where the change has to happen, as opposed to the mechanism for the exposure, the voice, throughout the organization, the elevation of that. So I think the lift and the friction may not justify or even remotely come close to the payoff that we're expecting and the expectations.
Yeah, I would agree with both Doug and Lisa. And the one thing I'd add is talking to this group of directors who, sit on both boards in Europe that have co-determination and boards in the US that don't. One thing that they all almost universally stressed was that you have to have a solution to bringing worker voice to the board that's culturally appropriate. And that can vary not just from country to country, but from board to board. And so we have, I think, a ways to go, but I don't think focusing on, is co-determination the only answer? No, I think Lisa's totally right. Like, let's not lose the goal and get caught in there's one way to do this. Bianca has been introducing some really interesting approaches that they've been using. There's lots of other companies taking actions to try and bring worker voice in different ways. So I don't think focusing on one particular way of doing it is as helpful as focusing on the value of ensuring that it happens.
Yeah, I think it really has to happen more at the operational and management level. The whole debate about, well, what happened to the unions? Why are they such a, have they become less and less relevant in industry? And what we see at Amazon and elsewhere in terms of the tools that management use to prevent workers from being able to organize and advocate for their needs. Whatever happened to that? And in place of that, it's not like we bring back the unions to make them more powerful or whatever. There might be an alternative that we're just not thinking about. Government does have a role to play here. And I think that's where it has to happen. How is a mass of employees supposed to organize to get better treatment and better benefits, as opposed to kind of each employee trying to advocate for themselves, which is clear they lose. So I think that's really the rub.
Thank you, guys. So if I can do one really quick lightning round for you guys, maybe one thing that makes you kind of optimistic or excited about kind of where we're headed in terms of worker voice. I mean, as a society, as a business community, to me, the developments around worker voice recently are very exciting. But I'd love to hear from you guys on an optimistic note. Doug, sorry about that, but I've got to do it to you. What's your source of optimism moving forward around worker voice in this moment?
I think the exciting thing is all the discussion around, kind of generational change in attitudes as new generations come up in the workforce. There's a lot of kind of anecdotal and conventional wisdom that the younger generation, is willing to express themselves more. They're willing to kind of sacrifice some pay for a better way of, better lifestyle, that kind of stuff. I think there needs to be more kind of study. I mean, I think there's something there, but we should really be studying that and tracking the trends. But I think, to me, that's an exciting prospect that the younger generation could really drive this.
I'll piggyback on that because mine is a little bit similar, although it's a younger generation of companies. We tend to work a lot with up and coming companies that are approaching the point of being public, and seeing that there seems to have been among many of these companies already a paradigm shift where it's not about, oh, we have to get the worker voice in here. It's how can we harness the worker voice to help us, seize opportunities, reduce risks. How do we do it better? Here's some creative ideas we're having. So for me, the energy and the optimism is really coming from the companies that are thinking about this in really creative ways, and where management and board members are actually see themselves as allies in this rather than seeing it as a paradigm where it's, an us versus them.
Bianca, go ahead, and then Lisa, we'll close with you.
I'd say the things that I find the most exciting is just the changing landscape. From where I sit, I'm personally very excited to see what happens in LA County, what happens in Harris County in Texas, both of which have these experiments that are nascent. We have yet to see what could be possible when you put workers as co-pilots in a specific segment of the operation. To Doug's point, I agree. Like, a lot of these problems are at the operational level, and letting workers have a role there, to me just seems like a great first step. So those two experiments excite me.
Great. Lisa?
I would say that I'm most excited about the number of CEOs that I see cutting out the middle layer, establishing direct communication with various ERG groups, empowering them, supporting them in a really authentic way, as opposed to something that, we have to do on the side, but really making it a part of how they govern. And it is exciting, and it's new.
This is tremendous. Thank you, all four of you, for sharing so much wisdom and insight with us today. I do want to do a quick plug of two upcoming webinars. This is a busy week in webinar land. I don't know if anyone's seen in their inbox. It seems like everyone's been keeping their powder dry for this week and dropping a bunch of webinars. Tomorrow, my boss and the founder and executive director of the Aspen Business and Society program, Judy Samuelson, is going to be in conversation with Rosalind Brewer, and that is part of an Aspen Institute kind of leadership series. And so that will be tomorrow on the 14th. And later this week, our colleagues in the Economic Opportunities program at the Aspen Institute are also hosting a webinar that I think will interest people who have joined this one, and that's on how corporations can build quality jobs. And it's really about financial wellness, but it's a very busy week and lots of compelling stuff out there. Thank you, all four of you, for making the time and sharing with us. Thanks everyone in the audience for joining us today. I apologize, I'm 2 minutes over, so I will be deducted pay for that. And we will see you next time. I appreciate it. Thanks everybody.